For most of the 20th century, Hollywood built entire careers borrowing from a world it never actually lived in. A pimp who ran Oakland, a kingpin who took over Harlem, a veteran who robbed an armored car for a cause, a neighborhood enforcer everyone was scared of, a stick-up woman who never raised her voice. You already know these characters. What Hollywood didn't always tell you is that some of them weren't characters at all. We start with someone different from the rest of this list. Not a man one film was based on, but a man who spent 50 years as the actual bridge between real street culture and the version Hollywood kept selling back to America. He crowned himself the best in the business 13 years running, found God in the middle of a drug-fueled vision, and somehow ended up starring in music videos next to the same artists sampling the culture he came from. This is Bloody Reports. Every case here is built from court records, contemporaneous reporting, and published accounts, not legend. 50 years later, that party is still happening. Every single year. Streamed, photographed, celebrated by some of the biggest names in hip-hop. The man who started it named himself Pimp of the Year, 13 years in a row, at his own event. Then one day in 1985, high on PCP, he says God spoke to him. He walked away from the life completely and became something almost nobody who knew him back then saw coming, an ordained bishop. Today you know him from movie cameos, from Snoop Dogg's music videos, from a genuinely bizarre public campaign in 2008 to personally reach out and save Britney Spears. His name is Bishop Don Magic Juan. This is the real story, not the caricature. He was born Donald Campbell on Chicago's West Side into a neighborhood where church, street life, ambition, and survival all existed on the same block. By his mid-teens, he was already in the game, patterning himself after the men he saw around him and the world described in Iceberg Slim's writing and films like Superfly. Chicago's Madison Street became his stage. What made him different wasn't just the lifestyle, it was the theater of it. Green and gold suits, a money green Cadillac, a gold crucifix worn like a piece of street armor, years before the bishop title had any spiritual meaning attached to it at all. He built a catchphrase that outlived his career in the life by decades. Green is for the money, gold is for the honeys. He even ran a record store, Don Juan's Music World, that doubled as part of his operation and his image. In 1974, he threw himself a birthday party. It grew into the Players' Ball, an annual gathering that became the real-world institution behind every fictional players' convention scene Hollywood would later put in a movie. He crowned himself Pimp of the Year at his own event, 13 years straight, and somehow that self-awarded title became a legitimate piece of American pop culture instead of a joke nobody remembered. Decades later, Dave Chappelle parodied it directly on his own show, calling it the Playa Haters Ball. That's not obscure trivia. That's a man's self-invented street title getting national television satire because it had become that recognizable. Then, in 1985, everything turned. By his own account, written years later in his book, From the Pimp Stick to the Pulpit, the moment came while he was under the influence of CP. He described a vision, a message he understood as coming directly from God, and he made the decision on the spot to walk away from the life entirely. He didn't just quietly retire. He rebuilt his entire public identity around it. He ordained himself a bishop. He kept the flash, the suits, the presence, the theater, and pointed all of it somewhere completely different. If this is the kind of history you want more of, the real people behind the culture, not the myths built on top of them, subscribe. That's the whole channel. What happened next is the part almost nobody expects. Instead of disappearing, Bishop Don Magic Juan became more visible than he'd ever been as a young pimp on Madison Street. In 1999, he appeared in the documentary American Pimp, which introduced his exact persona: the green and gold, the theatrical cadence, the unmistakable presence, to a national audience for the first time as himself, not as inspiration for someone else's character. From there, Hollywood came looking for him directly. He appeared in Old School, in SWAT, in Starsky and Hutch. He showed up in 50 Cent and Snoop Dogg's video for PIMP in 2003, standing in the exact cultural space his younger self had helped invent. He also, by his own promotional materials, positioned himself as a spiritual advisor to a list of major names in music and entertainment, a claim that's been repeated widely but isn't independently documented the way his film and television appearances are, so it belongs in this story as something he said about himself, not as confirmed fact. And then there's 2008, the detail that sits strangely alongside everything else because it's genuinely sincere. Britney Spears was in the middle of a very public personal crisis. Bishop Don Magic Juan launched a website with one purpose: reaching out to her directly, offering the same kind of spiritual intervention he believed had saved his own life in 1985. It didn't go viral the way a stunt would. It mostly just existed, a strange, earnest gesture from a man whose entire second act was built on the idea that redemption can come from the most unlikely direction possible. The Players' Ball is still running. Decades after that first birthday party, it remains one of the longest-running self-created cultural institutions to come out of Chicago's West Side, outlasting most of the fictional versions of it that Hollywood ever put on screen. That's the whole shape of Bishop Don Magic Juan's story. Not a character somebody else built a movie around. A real man who spent one half of his life inventing the aesthetic Hollywood would spend decades borrowing, and the other half trying, in his own strange and public way, to save people from the version of himself he used to be. Bishop Don Magic Juan built his whole persona one generation into a world that already had its own legends, men one city over, one era earlier, who the culture would eventually put directly on film. One of them financed his own movie with his own money, walked onto the set, and played himself on camera, and never lived to see it released. October the 9th, 1972. A brand new Rolls-Royce, parked on a quiet street. Behind the wheel, a man in a tailored suit, 32 years old, diamond jewelry on his hands worth close to $10,000. Someone walks up to the window, shot in the back of the head. The jewelry stripped off his body before the engine even stopped running. The man behind the wheel is Frank Ward, the most powerful pimp in Oakland, the godfather of the underworld, a man so famous in this city that a Major League Baseball star once put his family's name on the stadium scoreboard during a live game. But here is why you are hearing this story. At the moment he was killed, a Hollywood movie based on his life was still being filmed. He had paid for part of it with his own money. He had walked onto the set and played himself on camera. He had given the director access to a world no outsider had ever been allowed to see. The film was called The Mack. It came out 5 months after his body was pulled from that Rolls-Royce. It made millions. It launched careers. It became one of the most iconic black films ever made. Jay-Z sampled it. Tupac quoted it. Too Short built an entire career on the archetype it created. And the man it was based on was already in the ground. He never saw the movie. He never heard the applause. He never knew that the word Mack would outlive him by half a century. This is that story. Uniontown, Alabama, 1940. Frank Ward is born into a family of sharecroppers. Black, deep South, cotton and red clay and nothing else. A large family and every child works the farm. But Frank's parents see something in him, something different, and they make a decision that changes the trajectory of his entire life. They send him to California for a better education. In school, Frank excels. He is smart. He is a star on the track team. He is the kind of kid teachers point to and say, "That one is going somewhere," but school does not pay. And in the 11th grade, Frank Ward drops out. He starts hustling in Los Angeles, selling jewelry on the streets with his 4 brothers, who had already moved to California before him. For years, the Ward brothers make good money. Frank has a girlfriend. He has his first son at 19. Life is moving, but Los Angeles starts getting hot. The police are cracking down on hustlers. Men are getting arrested, and a pattern starts to form. Guys from Los Angeles are taking their girlfriends up north to Oakland to get into the pimp game, because Oakland in that era is a different kind of city. On one side, Oakland is being recognized worldwide as the birthplace of the Black Panther Party. Huey Newton, Bobby Seale, revolution in the streets. But there is another side, the underworld, the gangsters, the dealers, the pimps, the streetwise businessmen who set up shop in the shadows. A place where making money is the only thing that matters. In 1964, Frank Ward walks into Oakland's underworld, and pimping comes to him like he was born for it. He is nonviolent, charismatic, well-spoken, charming in a way that most men in his line of work are not. Women do not have to be convinced. They ask to be with him. Within months, Frank has almost a dozen women living in his apartment and working for him. And this is the part that separates Frank Ward from every pimp before or after him. He does not rule through fear. He does not beat his women. He does not threaten, terrorize, or intimidate. He rules through magnetism, through the kind of charm that makes a woman look at every other man in the room and decide none of them compare, through a presence that is impossible to teach and impossible to fake. The old heads in Oakland will tell you, on camera, decades later, that Frank Ward had something no one else in the game had. He was the kind of man who could have been anything: a politician, a businessman, a preacher. That intelligence, that ability to read a room and own it without raising his voice, that is not a pimp's skill. That is a leader's skill. And Frank Ward used it in the only arena America offered him in 1964 Oakland. And then his brothers follow, all of them. Every Ward brother moves to Oakland and gets into the game. People start calling them the Ward brothers, and they take over. Their territory is 7th Street, West Oakland, the kind of street that never goes to sleep, lined with restaurants, nightclubs, pool halls. After hours, the speakeasies open. The underground gambling rooms light up. Money moving in every direction, in every pocket, on every corner, from sundown to sunup. All of Frank's girls work on 7th Street, and over the years they make him very rich. A home in the hills, not the flats, the hills, where the views are and the police are not. Tailor-made suits with silk shirts, diamond jewelry that catches the light from across the room. Custom cars, only custom. Frank Ward does not drive a car off a lot. Every vehicle is built to his specifications, and he is known around town for giving out $100 bills as tips. At restaurants, at clubs, at barbershops. $100 handed to a waiter or a bartender the way most men leave a $5. That is Frank Ward's calling card. A $100 handshake in the 1960s in Oakland. And here is a detail that tells you exactly how famous the Ward brothers become. Ted Ward, Frank's brother is tight with Reggie Jackson, the Reggie Jackson, one of the most famous baseball players in America. And Jackson arranges for the electronic scoreboard at the Oakland Coliseum to display a message during a live game. Welcome to the Ward Brothers, a major league stadium, 40,000 people, a pimp family's name in lights. That is not street fame. That is something else entirely. By 1968, Frank takes it further. He creates the Players Convention, a gathering where pimps from across California come together to give out an award for Pimp of the Year. Frank Ward invents an awards show for the street, a ceremony, with categories, with winners, a night where the men who run the underground dress in their finest and celebrate what they have built. And Frank does not just attend, he hosts, he organizes, he turns pimping into an event, a spectacle, something the city looks forward to. The Players' Convention becomes legendary in Oakland. It runs for years. And here is what you have to understand about what Frank Ward is doing, because it separates him from every other man in his position. Most pimps stay in the shadows. They make their money, they keep their heads down, they hope the law does not notice them. Frank does the opposite. He steps into the light. He builds a public image. He makes himself visible on purpose because he understands something most men in his world never figure out. Visibility is protection. When the mainstream media writes about you, when baseball stars put your name on a scoreboard, Frank starts buying property, opens shops, builds a portfolio that, on paper, looks like a legitimate businessman's holdings. He is washing his money the smart way, turning street cash into real estate and storefronts and the kind of paper trail that gives a man options if the game ever turns on him. And he writes a movie script on prison toilet paper. Prison toilet paper. That is what the screenplay is written on. The script is called The Mack and His Pack. It is loosely based on the life of Frank Ward, a story about a man named Goldie who gets out of prison and becomes the biggest Mack in Oakland. Bobby P. gets the script to movie producers on the outside. They read it, they like it, but they have one condition: Frank Ward has to be involved. Because the producers understand something. You cannot make a movie about the Oakland underworld without the man who runs the Oakland underworld. You do not point a camera at a world you do not own without asking the man who does. So they go to Frank, and Frank agrees. He gives the director and the producer something they could never have gotten without him: access, real access, to the underworld, to the pimps, the hustlers, the women, the after-hours spots, the corners and clubs that no outsider has ever been allowed to see. In exchange, Frank gets a role in the film, and he gets paid as a consultant, but he gives them more than access. He gives them protection. His crew keeps the set safe in neighborhoods where a film production would be robbed clean in an hour. Without Frank's men, the cameras do not roll. Without his name on the project, no one on 7th Street lets the outsiders through. He gives them his wardrobe, his actual suits, shoes, and hats. The film's wardrobe coordinator, a man named Nate Adams, builds the costumes from the real thing. When the actor playing Goldie walks into a scene dressed like a king, those are Frank Ward's real clothes on another man's body. He gives them his cars, his real fleet. On camera, every vehicle you see in the Mack belongs to someone who is actually in the game. He gives them his people, not actors, real pimps, real hustlers, real women from the life. The extras in the Mack are not performing, they are living. That is why the film feels different from every other movie of that era. The scenes in the bars, the clubs, the streets, those are real people in their real world, caught on film because Frank Ward opened the door and let the cameras in. The production is guerrilla style. No union crew. almost entirely black and Puerto Rican technicians behind the camera at a time when Hollywood will not let black people touch the equipment. It is one of the first major films ever made with a predominantly non-white technical crew. That detail alone makes it historic. But nobody talks about it because the story in front of the camera is louder than the story behind it, and he gives them himself. Frank Ward appears in the movie. He is in the barbershop scene. He is in the Players' Ball scene where Goldie wins Mack of the Year. Frank came in second, a real pimp, in a movie based on his life, losing a fictional award to the actor pretending to be him. Max Julian, the actor playing Goldie, studies Frank to build the character. He watches how Frank moves, how he pauses before he speaks, how a room rearranges itself when he walks through the door. Julian absorbs it all and puts it on screen. And Richard Pryor is there too. Third, build, playing a character called Slim. Pryor is brilliant. He is also out of control. Cocaine is eating him alive. He misses calls, disappears for days. And on at least one occasion, Julianne has to physically stop Pryor from attacking the producer with a sock full of ball bearings. That is the set of the Mack. Real pimps, real hustlers, a cocaine-fueled comedian with a weapon, and the man the whole movie is based on, standing right there, watching Hollywood try to capture his life. But there is a problem the production cannot solve. The movie is being made in Black Panther territory. One night, Bobby Seale, co-founder of the Black Panthers, bursts into the hotel room of the film's producer. He demands $5,000 for making the movie in Panther territory. When Frank finds out, he is furious. He tells the director that from now on, he will be on set personally to make sure nothing like that happens again. But Frank Ward does not get to keep that promise. October the 9th, 1972, halfway through the filming of the movie, Frank Ward is sitting in his new Rolls-Royce, shot in the back of the head, killed at 32 years old, his jewelry stripped from his body. The rumors start immediately. Some point the finger at Huey Newton. The Black Panthers had been in conflict with the production for weeks. Frank had been blocking their extortion. The motive is there. Others say it was a product deal gone wrong. Others say it was a robbery brought on by Frank's flashy lifestyle and the diamonds he wore everywhere he went. The theories are endless, and that is exactly the problem, because no one was ever charged. No one was ever convicted. The murder of Frank Ward is unsolved to this day. After Frank's death, the cast and crew flee Oakland. They finish the film in Los Angeles, afraid for their lives. Huey Newton insists that the proceeds from the Oakland premiere go to the Black Panthers community programs. The Panthers get their money after all. The Mack is released in 1973. The opening credits carry a tribute to Frank Ward, and the film explodes. Made for under $1 million, it earns millions. It becomes one of the most important black films ever made. More authentic than Shaft, more raw than Superfly. Because the Mack is not a Hollywood fantasy. It is the streets of Oakland on film, performed by the people who actually live there. And here is what makes the legacy so painful. The Mack changes everything for the people in it. Max Julian becomes a cultural icon. He is Goldie forever. When he dies in January of 2022, at 88 years old, the tributes pour in from every corner of hip-hop. But Julian would be the first to tell you, he did not create Goldie, he borrowed him from a dead man. Richard Pryor, the man who nearly destroyed the production with cocaine and a sock full of ball bearings, goes on to become the most famous comedian in the history of America. His performance as Slim is still studied 50 years later. The dialogue becomes gospel. sampled by rappers for the next half-century. Too Short, from Oakland, builds his entire career on the pimp archetype the Mack defines. He takes Frank Ward's world and turns it into platinum records. Jay-Z samples it, Tupac quotes it, Snoop, Ice Cube, E40, Master P. The lines spoken by real pimps and real hustlers in a low-budget Oakland film become the most sampled dialogue in rap history outside of James Brown. The fashion comes back. The suits, the hats, the alligator shoes. Every pimp-themed music video of the 90s and 2000s traces its visual language back to what Frank Ward and his brothers wore on camera in 1972. The word Mack itself goes global because of this movie. It is still in the dictionary. It is still in every rapper's vocabulary. And it traces back through the film to one man leaning back in a barbershop chair in Oakland, saying words the whole world would eventually learn. And the Ward brothers, what happens to them after Frank? They scatter. Ted Ward, Frank's closest brother, his right hand, relocates out of Oakland. The other brothers spread out across the country. Without Frank, there is no center. Without the king, the court collapses. The 7th Street Kingdom, the fleet of custom cars, the women who lined up, the $100 tips, the scoreboard at the Coliseum, all of it dissolves within months of the murder. Because the empire was never the empire. The empire was the man. And the moment the man stopped breathing, everything he built went with him. Carol Speed, the actress who played Lulu in the film, had been in a relationship with Frank during the shoot. His murder destroys her. She leaves California entirely, 300 miles from the city where it was born. And the murder of Frank Ward remains exactly where it was the day after it happened. Unsolved. No arrest, no conviction, no justice. Over 50 years of silence. An author named Chloe Silvers spent years digging into the case for a book called The Fabulous Ward Brothers. Her investigation pointed away from the Black Panthers and toward a different set of suspects entirely. But the family, by most accounts, does not want the full truth told. And the Oakland police in 1972 were not breaking down doors to solve the murder of a black pimp, no matter how famous he was. So the case sits, cold, the way it has been since the day Frank Ward's blood dried on the seat of that Rolls-Royce. In a 2002 documentary about the making of the film, the director Michael Campus and the star Max Julien both speak on the kind of person Frank Ward was. Both of them agree. He could have been anything. He could have been whatever he wanted in life. He was an extraordinary human being. Frank could have been anything he wanted to be. But Frank Ward became a pimp. And a pimp became a legend. And a legend was killed before the world ever got to meet him. In the barbershop scene of the Mack, Frank Ward leans back in the chair and says his only line, "I do mine from Frisco to Maine." You know how that is. 5 months later, the audience heard it for the first time. Frank Ward had been dead since October. Frank Ward's story ends in Oakland in 1973, 5 months before the world ever saw the movie he paid for. 18 years later, a very different kind of film hit theaters, and the man behind its most famous villain built an empire the real Harlem streets are still talking about. You have seen the courtroom scene. Nino Brown stands up. Wesley Snipes in a suit, facing the judge, facing the jury, facing the whole system. And he delivers the most famous speech in the history of black crime cinema. "I am not guilty. You are the one that is guilty. The lawmakers, the politicians, the Colombian lords, all you who lobby against making it legal, just like you did with alcohol during Prohibition. You are the one that is guilty. 34 years later, people still quote those words. They put them on t-shirts. They sample them in songs. Lil Wayne named his album series after the building in the movie. Cash Money Records named their entire label after the gang in the film. But here is what nobody ever told you. Those words were not written by a screenwriter. They were stolen from a real man in a real courtroom in Boston. A kingpin named Darryl Whiting stood up at his own trial and said almost exactly those words to a real judge. And the writers of New Jack City took that speech, barely changed it, and put it in Wesley Snipes' mouth. That is not the only thing they took, because Nino Brown was never one man. He was four real kingpins from 4 different cities stitched together into a single character. And the movie that made $47 million, that launched careers, that defined an entire era of black cinema, was built on the bones of men whose names the audience was never told. One from Detroit, one from Harlem, one from Queens, one from Boston. Each one gave Nino Brown a piece of himself. The apartment building came from one. The style and the swagger came from another. The world he operated in came from a third. And the courtroom speech, the most quoted scene in the entire film, came from the fourth. This is the real story behind New Jack City. The 4 men who became Nino Brown. This is that story. Start with Detroit, because that is where the structure came from. The Chambers brothers, Larry, Billy Joe, Willie Lee, Otis. 4 brothers from Marianna, Arkansas, a town so small and so poor that a young man's options ran from the cotton field to the highway out of town. The Chambers brothers took the highway. They went to Detroit. And in Detroit, in the mid-1980s, they built something that the city had never seen before. They took over an apartment building, not a corner, not a block, an entire building, a 4-story, 52-unit complex called the Broadmoor on East Grand Boulevard. And they turned every floor into a different operation, different product on each level, families still living in the building alongside the business, tenants who could not leave because the Chambers brothers had made it clear that leaving was not an option. If that sounds familiar, it is because you have seen it before. In the movie, Nino Brown takes over an apartment complex called the Carter. He moves the tenants out. He runs the operation from inside, floor by floor, unit by unit. A building turned into a machine. The Carter is the Broadmoor. The movie changed the name, changed the city, changed the faces. The structure is the same building in Detroit, lifted frame by frame. And the Chambers brothers did not run it like a corner crew. They ran it like a corporation. When the police raided their operation, they found organization charts, written bylaws, rules for the workers. Street-level dealers were told not to wear gold jewelry or expensive sneakers while on shift because it attracted attention. Workers recruited from their hometown in Arkansas were paid $500 a week and brought to Detroit specifically to move product. At their peak, the Chambers brothers supplied roughly 700 locations across the city. Every day, 700. They controlled over 50% of the entire market in Detroit. And they were generating, by federal estimates, $3 million a day. $3 million a day. From 4 brothers from a town most people have never heard of. And then the tape surfaced. Because the Chambers brothers made the mistake that men swimming in that much cash always make. They got comfortable. And someone recorded them counting money, not on a table, in laundry baskets, actual laundry baskets overflowing with bills, and the brothers laughing and bragging while they sorted through it. That tape became evidence, And in February of 1988, a joint task force took them down. 18 months of investigation, $1 million in cash and jewelry seized, 68 vehicles, 250 pieces, 6 kilograms of product. Larry Chambers got life. Billy Joe got 45 years. Otis got 27. Willie got 21. 4 brothers, 1 building, and a movie that took their blueprint and put Wesley Snipes in front of it. But the Chambers brothers' story has one more detail that the movie captured without ever crediting. In the film, Nino Brown runs his operation with corporate precision. He has rules. He has structure. He promotes from within. He demotes and punishes people who break protocol. The Cash Money brothers in the movie are not a crew. They are a company. That is not Hollywood invention. That is a direct copy of how the Chambers brothers actually operated. Federal prosecutors described their organization as running like a Fortune 500 company. They had employee handbooks. They had chains of command. They recruited from their hometown in Arkansas, brought young men to Detroit on buses, paid them $500 a week, and gave them rules to follow. No flashy clothes on the clock. No drawing attention. Show up on time. Move the product. Bring the money back. When the tape surfaced of Larry Chambers counting bills in laundry baskets, the thing that shocked investigators was not the volume of cash. It was the casual professionalism of how it was being handled. Like payroll at a warehouse, like accounting at a firm. The money was the business, and the business was run like a business. That entire corporate crime structure, the thing that makes New Jack City feel different from Scarface or The Godfather, came from 4 brothers in Detroit who never saw a dime from the movie that borrowed their model. Now, move to Harlem, because that is where the character came from. Nicky Barnes, Leroy Nicky Barnes. If you know this channel, you know the name. We are not going to retell his full story here because that has been done. But you need to understand what Nicky Barnes gave to Nino Brown, because without Barnes, the character does not exist. In the 1970s, Nicky Barnes was the most famous kingpin in America. Not the biggest, the most famous. He appeared on the cover of the New York Times Magazine in 1977 under a headline that made the President of the United States pick up the phone. Mr. Untouchable. That cover triggered a direct order from President Carter to find a way to bring Barnes down. Barnes ran a council of 7 black figures in Harlem. He dressed like a movie star before any movie was made about him. He walked into courtrooms like he owned them. He was acquitted so many times that the name Untouchable was not a boast. It was a record. When the screenwriter Barry Michael Cooper sat down to write what would become New Jack City, he was originally working on a script about Nicky Barnes for Quincy Jones. That Barnes script evolved, changed cities, changed decades, and became the story of Nino Brown. The Harlem setting, the style, the arrogance, the sense of invincibility, the idea of a black man so powerful that the system itself could not touch him. That is Nicky Barnes, transplanted from the 70s to the 80s, wrapped in a new name and handed to Wesley Snipes. Now moved to Queens, because that is where the war came from. Lorenzo Fat Cat Nichols, Southeast Queens, South Jamaica, 150th Street, a neighborhood that, in the 1980s, was the center of everything the rest of the city was afraid of. Fat Cat grew up in that world. He was not an outsider who moved in. He was from the soil. And by his early 20s, he controlled a significant piece of Southeast Queens with a grip that combined street-level authority with genuine community presence. He was known for giving back. Thanksgiving turkeys, school supplies, The kind of visible generosity that makes a neighborhood protect a man even when they know what he does after dark. That dual identity is one of the things the movie captured about Nino Brown. The scene where Nino distributes food to the community. That is not a Hollywood invention. That is what men like Fat Cat actually did. They understood that the neighborhood's silence was a product that had to be purchased, and the currency was not just fear, it was loyalty bought with kindness. But behind the turkeys and the school supplies was an operation that ran on absolute control. Fat Cat did not tolerate competition. He did not tolerate disloyalty. And he had a man whose job was to make sure everyone in South Jamaica understood the cost of both. His name was Howard Mason. The streets called him Pappy. Pappy Mason was not a businessman. Pappy Mason was a message. He was the enforcement arm of Fat Cat's world, and his reputation in Queens was the kind that made people cross the street when they saw him coming, not out of disrespect, out of survival instinct. And Pappy Mason did something that turned a New York City street story into a national crisis. On February the 26th, 1988, a 22-year-old rookie police officer named Edward Byrne was sitting in his patrol car in South Jamaica, Queens. He had been on the force for less than a year. On this night, he had been assigned to guard the house of a witness, a man who had agreed to cooperate with the authorities against local dealers. A simple, static assignment. Sit in the car, watch the house, make sure nobody bothers the witness. At 3:30 in the morning, someone approached the car. Officer Byrne never made it home. The order, according to federal prosecutors, came from Pappy Mason, and the message was not just for the witness, it was for the entire borough, for every potential cooperator, for every person in Queens who might have been thinking about picking up the phone and calling the law. The message was, this is what happens. Edward Byrne was 22 years old. He had wanted to be a police officer since he was a child. His father was a retired police lieutenant. He had graduated from the academy and been on patrol for 5 months. The reaction was seismic. The city erupted. 10,000 police officers attended his funeral. The commissioner called it an attack on civilized society. And the federal government, which had been watching the street-level trade with growing alarm but limited tools, used the Byrne case as the turning point. New federal sentencing guidelines came out of that case. The crackdown that followed reshaped how the government prosecuted street organizations for the next 3 decades. Mandatory minimums, enhanced penalties, federal jurisdiction over cases that had previously been handled locally. The entire legal architecture that defined the war on the product trade in the 90s traces back, in part, to what happened to a 22-year-old rookie sitting in a patrol car in South Jamaica. One order from an enforcer in Queens changed the legal landscape of the entire country. Fat Cat Nichols was convicted of running a continuing criminal enterprise. He received life plus 45 years. Pappy Mason was convicted separately and received life. The South Jamaica operation was dismantled piece by piece. And the world they built, the world of street-level terror so extreme that even the law itself was a target, is the world new. Jack City drops Nino Brown into. The violence, the stakes, the sense that nobody is safe, not the police, not the witnesses, not the civilians walking past on their way to the store. That atmosphere of absolute menace is not the Chambers Brothers' Detroit. It is not Nicky Barnes's Harlem. It is Fat Cat's Queens. And it is the thing that gives New Jack City its spine. And now, Boston, the last piece. The one that hides in plain sight because it is the most famous scene in the entire film. Darryl Whiting. They called him God. A Boston kingpin who ran one of the most violent operations in the city during the late 80s. When Whiting went to trial, he stood up in the courtroom and delivered a speech that stunned the room. He told the judge the system was guilty. He told the jury that the politicians and the lawmakers were the real criminals. He said the war on the product was a lie designed to keep black men in cages while the real money flowed through channels no black man would ever be allowed to touch. Sound familiar? The writers of New Jack City took Darryl Whiting's courtroom outburst and put it in Nino Brown's mouth, almost word for word. The most iconic scene in the entire film, the one people quote at parties, the one that launched 1,000 T-shirts, was spoken first by a real man in a real courtroom in Boston, and nobody told the audience. So now you have the full picture. The building came from Detroit, 4 brothers from Arkansas who turned a 52-unit apartment complex into a machine that generated $3 million a day and got caught counting money in laundry baskets. The character came from Harlem, a man so untouchable that the President of the United States had to personally order his takedown, and whose style and arrogance became the template for the most famous villain in black cinema. The world came from Queens, a street king whose enforcer gave an order that took a 22-year-old cop and changed federal sentencing law for the next 30 years. And the speech came from Boston, a kingpin who stood up in court and told the system it was guilty, and whose words ended up in Wesley Snipes' mouth without credit, without acknowledgement, without anyone in the audience ever knowing they were hearing a real man's real fury played back as fiction. 4 men, 4 cities, 1 character. New Jack City took each of them, stripped away their names, and built Nino Brown out of the parts. The movie made $47 million. It launched Wesley Snipes into stardom. It made Ice-T a credible actor. It put Chris Rock on the map. And then the ripple effects went even further than the box office. Cash Money Records, the label that gave the world Lil Wayne, Juvenile, and the Hot Boys, took its name directly from the Cash Money brothers in the film. Lil Wayne named his album series Tha Carter after the apartment complex in the movie, which means one of the best-selling album series in hip-hop history is named after a fictional building that was based on a real building in Detroit called the Broadmoor that belonged to 4 brothers from Arkansas who are serving decades in federal prison. The chain runs from the Chambers Brothers' real apartment building to a fictional movie set to one of the most famous album titles in music. And the men at the beginning of that chain have never been acknowledged, never been compensated, and most of them have never been free since the day they were sentenced. Lil Wayne and Tyga have both referred to themselves as Young Nino. Larry Chambers got life in a federal cell. Nicky Barnes disappeared into witness protection and never came back. Fat Cat Nichols got life plus 45 years. Pappy Mason got life. Darryl Whiting went to prison, and his courtroom speech became somebody else's famous scene. 4 real lives, 4 real sentences, compressed into one fictional legend, and a movie that earned $47 million off their stories without ever saying their names. That is the real story behind New Jack City. The story the credits never told you. You watched Wesley Snipes play a character. You thought it was one man's story. It was 4. And every one of them paid for the life the movie made look glamorous. Nino Brown's Rise and Fall was built for a movie screen. What's Next wasn't built for anything. It was a real robbery by a real veteran, framed as something closer to a cause than a crime. Washington, D.C., 1969. A mail truck is moving through the city. Early morning, routine run. The driver has made this trip 100 times. He is carrying bags of old, worn-out currency from the Federal Reserve to the Treasury Department, where the bills will be counted, recorded, and destroyed. Dead money. Bills so worn they are being taken out of circulation. Not fresh stacks with crisp serial numbers. Wrinkled, faded, beaten-up cash that the government has decided is no longer fit to use. The kind of money nobody is supposed to want, because in a few hours it will not exist anymore. 3 men step into the road. Their faces are covered in ash. Dark gray smudges rubbed across their skin like war paint. One of them is dressed like a postal worker. They stop the truck. They approach the driver, and they take $382,000 in currency that was on its way to be burned. But here is the detail that separates this robbery from every other robbery in the history of Washington, D.C. One of the men looks at the driver, and he says something that nobody in that driver's position has ever heard before. This money is for needy black kids. Then he gives the driver an instruction. Tell the police the robbers were white. He pauses, changes his mind. Tell them some brothers robbed you, and they all look alike. $382,000. Ash on their faces. A mail truck full of money the government was about to destroy. And a line delivered to the driver that sounds like it belongs in a movie. 26 years later, it will be in a movie. One of the most powerful black films of the 90s. A film that will star Lorenz Tate, Chris Tucker, and Keith David. A film directed by the same 2 brothers who made Menace to Society. The film will be called Dead Presidents, and it will be based on this man. But the film will change things. It will add violence he never committed. It will invent a war scene he never lived. It will give his character a tragic ending that sends him to prison as the credits roll and the screen goes black. And the real man, watching the film in a theater in 1995, will lean back in his seat and say 5 words that tell you more than the entire movie does. The movie ends where my life begins. Because what happened after the robbery, after the conviction, after the prison cell, is a story Hollywood did not have the imagination to tell. A robber who became an inmate leader who testified before the United States Congress, a convict who was invited to the White House by the President of the United States. The film gave you the fall. This is the rise that came after it. This is the story of Haywood T. Kirkland, the real man behind Dead Presidents. This is that story. Start with Vietnam, because that is where everything breaks. Haywood Kirkland grows up in the Bronx, a working-class black family in a working-class neighborhood in a country that is about to ask young men like him to do something their country will never fully repay them for. By the mid-1960s, the Vietnam War is consuming a generation, and the generation it is consuming disproportionately is black. In 1967, black soldiers make up 11% of the American population, but nearly 25% of the combat casualties in Vietnam. They are dying at more than twice their proportion of the population, and the men who are sending them have no plan for what happens when they come home. Kirkland goes to Vietnam. He serves. He sees the things that every man who went to that war saw, and that none of them were prepared to see. The jungle, the fear, the friends who were there in the morning and gone by afternoon, the confusion of fighting a war that half the country at home has decided is wrong while you are still in the middle of it. And for black soldiers, the war carries an extra weight. They are fighting for a country that, back home, will not let them drink from the same water fountains as the men standing next to them in the foxhole. They are defending democracy in Southeast Asia, while their families back in the Bronx and Baltimore and Birmingham are still marching for the right to vote. The contradiction is not abstract. It is specific. It is daily. It is the knowledge that the man beside you in the squad would not be allowed to sit beside you in a restaurant in Mississippi. Kirkland comes home, and the country that sent him does not want him back. In 1969, the term does not exist. What exists is a generation of young black men who cannot sleep, who flinch at loud noises, who rage at things that do not deserve rage, who drink to quiet the noise in their heads, who sit in apartments in the Bronx and wonder why they survived a war 10,000 miles away, only to come home and discover that survival was the easy part. Haywood Kirkland is one of those men, and in 1969, broke, angry, carrying a war in his chest that nobody around him can see or understand, he makes a decision. The mail truck. Here is what you have to understand about the target Kirkland chose, because it tells you something about the man that the movie completely misses. He did not rob a bank. He did not rob a store. He did not rob a person on the street. He robbed a mail truck carrying money that the United States government had already decided to destroy. Dead money. Worn-out bills on their way to a furnace. Currency that in a few hours would not exist. Kirkland and his two partners took money that was, in the government's own assessment, worthless. Money that was not going to pay anybody's salary or fund anybody's school or build anybody's road. Money that was headed for a fire. And when he told the driver it was for needy black kids, he was not performing. He was not delivering a line. He was telling the man what he believed, that the money the government was about to burn could feed children the government had decided not to feed, that the country he had fought for overseas was burning cash while the neighborhoods he came home to were burning from neglect. $382,000. Three men, ash on their faces, like the war paint of soldiers who had already fought one war and were now fighting another one, this time against the country that sent them to the first. They got away clean, for a while. And then, the way it always works, they did not. Kirkland was caught, he was convicted, and he was sent to the Lorton Correctional Complex in Virginia, a sprawling, overcrowded facility that at its peak held thousands of inmates from the District of Columbia, a place that was itself a kind of war zone, with its own hierarchies, its own violence, its own rules of survival that had nothing to do with the ones the courts imposed. And here is where the movie stops. In Dead Presidents, the character based on Kirkland, Anthony Curtis, played by Lorenz Tate, is sentenced to 15 years to life. He throws a chair at the judge. The bus pulls away. The screen goes black. The credits roll. That is where Hollywood leaves him, in a prison bus, heading to a cell. End of story. But Haywood Kirkland's story does not end on a prison bus. It begins there. Because inside Lorton, something happens that the Hughes brothers did not film, that Hollywood did not imagine, and that the audience never got to see. Kirkland becomes a leader, not a gang leader, not a block boss, a leader. Inside the facility, he organizes, he advocates, he speaks for men who cannot speak for themselves, men who are locked up and forgotten, men who served their country the same way he did and came home the same way he did and ended up in the same place he did. He becomes an advocate for incarcerated veterans, a voice inside the walls for men who fought in Vietnam, in Korea, in World War II, who came home and found themselves behind bars because the country that sent them to war had no plan for what happened after. And his voice is loud enough that it reaches outside the walls. Haywood Kirkland testifies before the United States Congress. From inside, a prison, a convicted robber, a Vietnam veteran, an inmate at Lorton, sitting in front of elected officials, and telling them the truth about what happens to veterans who are locked up, about the lack of mental health resources, about the lack of rehabilitation, about the fact that the men inside those walls fought for the flag that is hanging behind the committee members' chairs and were rewarded with cells instead of services. Congress listens. And then something happens that should be the climax of a movie, except the movie had already ended 2 reels too early. President Jimmy Carter invites Haywood Kirkland to the White House. The White House. The man who robbed a mail truck with ash on his face and told the driver the money was for needy black kids is invited to the home of the President of the United States. Because the work he did from inside a prison, the advocacy, the testimony, the organizing, was valuable enough that the leader of the free world wanted to hear from him directly. A mail truck robber in the White House, sitting in the same building where the decisions that sent him to Vietnam were made, talking to the man who inherited the mess those decisions created. That is the arc the movie does not show you. Robber to inmate to advocate to congressional witness to White House guest. A trajectory so improbable that if you pitched it to a screenwriter, they would say it was too much. Nobody would believe it. But it happened. It is documented. It is in the public record. The man who stole $382,000 in dead money with ash on his face stood in the White House and told the president what was wrong with the system that put him inside. And then, in 1995, Hollywood came calling, Albert and Alan Hughes. The same 2 brothers who had directed Menace to Society 2 years earlier, a film that redefined black cinema and launched careers and shook audiences in a way few films had before. The same directors who had hired real Crips to provide security on that film. The Hughes brothers were 21 when they made Menace. They were 23 when they made Dead Presidents. And they were drawn to Kirkland's story because it was the other half of the same coin they had already been examining. Menace was about young black men trapped in a cycle of violence in South Central. Dead Presidents was about young black men trapped in a cycle of violence that started in a jungle 10,000 miles away and followed them home. Same system, same failure, different zip code. The Hughes brothers found Kirkland's story in a book, Bloods, an oral history of the Vietnam War by black veterans, by a journalist named Wallace Terry. Terry had been the first black editor-in-chief of an Ivy League newspaper at Brown University. He had landed a Time magazine cover story in 1967 called The Negro in Vietnam, and he had spent years collecting the testimonies of black soldiers, their experiences during the war and after. Kirkland's chapter stood out: the robbery, the ash, the $382,000. The quote about needy black kids, the whole thing read like a movie. So they made one. Dead Presidents was released on October the 6th, 1995, 10 days before the Million Man March in Washington, D.C. The timing was not planned, but it was perfect. A film about black men abandoned by their country, released the same month a million black men gathered in the nation's capital to demand recognition. Lorenz Tate played the character based on Kirkland. Chris Tucker, in his breakout dramatic role before Friday made him a comedy star, played a veteran who came home addicted and could not find his way back. Keith David played the older mentor. Terrence Howard, in one of his earliest roles, played a pool hall regular. Bokeem Woodbine played the religious soldier. A cast of actors who would each go on to become major names assembled for a film that told the story of men America sent to war and then forgot. The film grossed over $24 million. And Haywood Kirkland, who by then had changed his name to Ari Sesu Meretazan, watched the movie in a theater. He saw his robbery turned into a different robbery. He saw his war turned into a different war. He saw violence added that he had never committed. He saw a character given a tragic ending that he, the real man, had long since moved past. And he told the Washington Post 5 words that sit on top of this entire story like a crown. The movie ends where my life begins. Think about what that means. Hollywood took the worst moment of his life, the robbery, the ash, the handcuffs, and made it the whole story. They filmed the fall and called it a movie. They put the credits after the prison bus and let the audience walk out of the theater believing that was the end. But the real man is sitting in the theater knowing that the end they showed is actually the beginning, that everything meaningful he ever did, the leadership, the advocacy, the testimony before Congress, the invitation to the White House, happened after the scene where the movie stops. The film showed a man destroyed by a system. The real man rebuilt himself inside that system and then stood in front of the people who run it and told them how to fix it. And Meredazon was honest about what the movie got wrong. He told the Post he never took a life. He never committed the violence the film depicted. He was expecting to see something he could recognize. Instead, he saw a dramatized version that took his robbery and wrapped it in a story that was not his. But he did not complain, because the movie, for all its inventions, did one thing right. It showed America what happens to black veterans who come home from war and find nothing waiting for them. It showed the emptiness, the rage, the desperation, the feeling of having given everything to a country that gives nothing back. That part was true. And that part was Kirkland's, even if the details around it were Hollywood's. So what do you take from the life of Haywood T. Kirkland? Take the quote, "The movie ends where my life begins. A man went to Vietnam. He came home broken. He robbed a mail truck with ash on his face and told the driver the money was for needy black kids. He went to prison. And then inside that prison, he became something the country that locked him up never expected. A leader, a voice, a man who testified before Congress and shook the president's hand and spent the second half of his life trying to fix the system that swallowed the first half. Hollywood saw the robbery and made a movie. The real man saw the movie and said, 'You missed the whole point. The fall is not the story. The fall is where the story starts.' $382,000, ash on his face, a quote about needy black kids, a prison cell, a congressional hearing, a White House invitation, and 5 words that every filmmaker in America should be required to hear before they turn a real man's life into a 2-hour entertainment. The movie ends where my life begins, halfway through. If this is the kind of history you want more of, the real people behind the characters you already know, subscribe. 2 more to go. That was a robbery with a cause attached to it. What's next is a comedy until you find out what the real man behind it was actually like. 1995, South Central Los Angeles. A movie theater on opening weekend. A black man is sitting in the dark watching a film about his neighborhood, his block, his city, his life. He is watching himself on screen. Not because his name is in the credits, not because any director called him, but because the man who wrote the movie grew up around him, watched him, was afraid of him, and turned him into the most memorable character in one of the most beloved black films ever made. The character's name is Debo, the bully who steals bikes and gold chains and slaps people senseless in broad daylight. The man the entire neighborhood moves around like weather. The man who walks into a room and makes grown mom go quiet without saying a word. The audience is laughing, because in the movie, Debo is comic relief. The neighborhood bully who terrorizes one block, who gets his chain snatched his bike stolen, his victims, until Craig Jones puts him on the ground in the final reel and the whole theater cheers. It is a comedy, a classic, one of the most beloved black films ever made. But the man the character was based on is not laughing, because in real life, the story is not a comedy. In real life, the man behind Debo ran one of the largest criminal enterprises in the history of Los Angeles, used a charity funded by the city government and donated to by NBA superstars to finance a criminal organization, the FBI, compared to the mafia. Held power over an entire city through a system of tribute and fear so complete that Grammy-winning producers let him use their studios for free. That NBA players paid six-figure sums to resolve disputes in his name. And in January 2021, federal prosecutors say he drove to Las Vegas, found a 21-year-old aspiring rapper he had once coached in high school, and that young man was found dead in the desert off Interstate 15. His name is Eugene Henley Jr. The streets called him Big U. And this is the story of the man Hollywood turned into a joke, and what he actually was. Before you understand what Big U built, you have to understand what South Central Los Angeles was in 1976, that defined street politics in South Central for the next 4 decades. Eugene Henley grew up in that world. He did not join the Rollin' 60s because he drifted into them. He joined them the way certain men join certain organizations, because he recognized something in their structure, their reach, and their power that matched the specific kind of ambition he had been carrying since he was old enough to understand what power meant in South Central Los Angeles. He was not the flashy type, not the man who bought the cars and wore the chains and made himself visible in ways that drew law enforcement attention. The men who operated that way in South Central during the 1980s tended to have short careers. The men who lasted understood something more fundamental. Control was more valuable than product. The man who controlled access to territory, to peace, to resolution, controlled everything else. You did not need to sell anything if you were the person everyone had to come to before they could sell anything at all. That was the specific understanding that Eugene Henley built his entire operation around. In the 1980s, when the LAPD attributed 13 homicides in a single year to just one rival organization, and when the epidemic that had consumed South Central's housing projects had turned every corner into both a market and a battlefield, Big U was becoming the man you came to when you needed something settled. Not a supplier, not a street-level operator, an enforcer of order. In the specific ecology of South Los Angeles in that era, the man who could end a conflict, resolve a dispute, and make two parties walk away without further escalation was worth more than any product on any corner. He was essential, and essential men do not get removed. They get paid. Big U built that reputation block by block through the 1980s, and then came 1991. The same year Ice Cube and DJ Pooh sat down to write the screenplay that would become Friday. The same year they would transform the specific energy of South Central into one of the most beloved comedies in the history of American cinema. Eugene Henley was arrested. A sting operation. An undercover Los Angeles sheriff's deputy. The details of what went wrong are less important than the outcome. 13 years in federal prison. He went in as a street enforcer with a reputation that made the people around him move carefully. He came out as something far more dangerous, a man who had spent 13 years studying. 2004. Big U walks out of prison. South Central has changed. The gang truces negotiated in the wake of the 1992 riots, an agreement between the Rollin' 60s, the Bounty Hunter Bloods, The Grape Street Crips and other major sets had changed some of the dynamics of street conflict. The violence that had defined the late 80s and early 90s had receded from its peak. New economies had emerged, and hip-hop had happened. The music that had grown out of South Central, out of the exact streets where Big U had built his reputation, had become a global billion-dollar industry. Artists from Los Angeles were the biggest names in music. Death Row Records had produced some of the most commercially successful albums in history. The culture that the streets had created was now being consumed everywhere, and the connection between that culture and those streets, the authentication, the legitimacy, the specific credibility that came from being real in a world of people performing realness, that connection was worth something very specific. Big U understood exactly what it was worth. He came out of prison and walked straight into the music industry. His first move was Kurupt, one of the most respected West Coast rappers of the 1990s, a member of the Dog Pound, a death row artist with credibility that ran deep into the culture. Big U positioned himself as a bridge, the man who could introduce you to the right people, the man whose endorsement meant something in rooms where authenticity was the currency. Through Kurupt, he got to Suge Knight. Through Suge Knight, he was inside the infrastructure of West Coast hip-hop at its highest level. And then a teenager named Ermias Asghedom started recording music in the downstairs studio of Big U's family home. The world would know him as Nipsey Hussle. Big U was the first person to sign Nipsey to a deal. Production, management. He brought in Steve LaBelle as the frontman because, as Henley put it himself in a documentary interview years later, you know how hard it was to be Big U. My reputation precedes me. That reputation, the same reputation that had made him the most feared enforcer in South Central through the 1980s, was now an asset in the music industry. The original gangster who mentored young artists, the man from the streets who opened doors, the OG whose blessing meant something. He managed Kurupt. He launched Nipsey Hussle. He built Unique Music, his own record label. And then he did something that transformed his public image entirely. He started a charity, Developing Options Incorporated, a nonprofit organization, a stated mission of reducing gang violence and providing opportunities for young people in South Central Los Angeles. A charity that received funding from the city of Los Angeles directly through the mayor's office Gang Reduction Youth Development Program. Federal money, city money, taxpayer money designated for the exact community that Eugene Henley had spent decades operating in. The optics were extraordinary. The man who had been one of the most feared figures in South Central, the man who had done 13 years in federal prison, had come home and committed himself to helping the next generation avoid the path he had taken. He was speaking at schools, appearing at community events, working with city officials, receiving grants from the mayor's office. And then FX came calling, Hip Hop Uncovered, a 6-part documentary series examining the intersection of hip-hop culture and the streets that produced it. Executive produced by Big U himself. 6 episodes presenting him to a national audience as a reformed original gangster, a community activist, a mentor, a man who had walked away from the womb and was now using his influence to build something positive. The documentary streamed on Hulu. It reached millions of people who had never heard his name. He became the godfather of hip-hop. That is what people called him. Not the streets, the press. The platform he had built through music connections, through the charity, through the documentary, made him one of the most publicly visible former gang leaders in the country. The man who Debo was based on had become a respected elder. That is what it looked like from the outside. Federal investigators were not looking from the outside. They were listening to the phones. The FBI's investigation into Eugene Henley and the Big U enterprise ran for 4 years. Wiretaps, financial records, witness interviews, a 107-page criminal complaint, and eventually a 43-count federal indictment that described in specific documented detail what was actually happening underneath the charity work and the documentary appearances and the mentor of Nipsey Hussle reputation. The charity was not what it appeared to be. When NBA players wrote checks to Developing Options Incorporated, when Grammy-winning producers donated, when corporations and athletes and entertainers gave money to an organization they believed was helping young people in South Central, court documents state that Big U immediately transferred those donations to his personal bank account. Shaquille O'Neal gave money. Draymond Green gave money. Both were defrauded, according to the indictment. Not a small amount lost to administrative overhead. The donations went directly into Henley's personal finances. The city grants followed the same pattern. Federal money designated for community programs was diverted. A COVID-19 pandemic relief loan application filed by Henley's music company, Unique Music, claimed the company operated at a $200,000 profit in 2019. Court records show the company actually operated at a $5,000 loss that year. The difference between those two numbers is the difference between qualifying for the loan and not qualifying. Prosecutors say the application was fraudulent, but the charity fraud, as extraordinary as it was only the surface layer sheet of what the Big U enterprise had actually built. Underneath it was the same system Big U had been running since the 1980s, just operated at a much higher level. The check-in system. If you were a high-profile person, an athlete, a celebrity, an entertainer, a businessman, coming to Los Angeles to operate in any way that touched the streets, you were expected to check in with Big U. Not because anyone sent you a formal request, because the understanding was in place throughout the culture. You checked in, you paid the appropriate tribute, and in return, you operated with the protection that came from Big U's endorsement. If you did not check in, the indictment documents, things went differently. In 2017, Henley recorded a video of a film crew operating in Hyde Park, his territory. On the recording, captured by federal investigators, anytime you want to do movies in the hood, just check it in. But if you don't check it in, we're going to check you in all right. We're going to check in all your equipment. This was not an empty warning. In June 2019, a professional boxer organized a private dice game in Los Angeles. The game involved NBA players. The boxer's associates used fixed dice to cheat the players. Because the boxer had not checked in with Henley before setting up the game on his territory, Henley dispatched members to confront the boxer, recover the players' money, and restore order. The boxer paid Big U $100,000 for the resolution. That is the Big U enterprise in operation. Not running product. Not in the traditional sense of a gang controlling corners. Running leverage. The specific leverage of a man whose reputation was so completely established and whose connections to the Roland 60s were so well understood that his presence in any dispute immediately changed the calculation for everyone involved. The indictment documents show that this system extended to extortion of businesses throughout Los Angeles, that it touched celebrities and athletes and entertainment industry figures at levels far above what any traditional street operation could reach. And then there was Rayshawn Williams. 21 years old, he was an aspiring rapper, signed to Unique Music, Big U's own label, a young man who had played wide receiver for Crenshaw High School's football team, a young man who had once played alongside Dion Henley on that same team, Big U's son, who would go on to become a linebacker for the Los Angeles Chargers. Big U had coached Rayshawn Williams. In January 2021, according to the federal complaint, Williams recorded a song aimed directly at Eugene Henley. A diss track. FBI Special Agent Andrew Rusa testified about the song in court proceedings. According to Rusa, the recording referenced Big U by name. It mocked his reputation. It questioned his standing. And in the song, according to investigators, Williams appeared to predict what would happen to him because of it. What followed is documented in the federal indictment and the 107-page criminal complaint. Big U arranged for Williams to record music at a Las Vegas studio. A studio owned by a Grammy-winning producer, identified only as Witness 2 in court documents, who, according to the complaint, made the studio available to Henley without charge, based on the power dynamic that the Big U enterprise maintained over him. Williams missed a scheduled session. Big U and his associate Sylvester Robinson drove from Los Angeles to Las Vegas. A witness identified as C.A. in court documents told investigators that Henley showed up at the Airbnb where Williams was staying. Williams said he had no transportation to the studio. They went to the studio together that night. Williams recorded music. Then they left separately. Rayshawn Williams was found deceased off Interstate 15 in the Las Vegas desert. Federal prosecutors say Henley is responsible. The 21-year-old he had coached, the same age as his son who was playing in the NFL, found in the desert, over a song. The federal complaint was unsealed. March 19, 2025. Before turning himself in, Big U recorded a video and posted it to social media. This is probably going to be my last video. I'm going to turn myself in to see what's going on. He surrendered to federal agents that same day. A federal magistrate reviewed the evidence and denied bail, finding that Henley represented both a flight risk and a danger to potential witnesses. The 43-count indictment handed down by a federal grand jury charged Henley with conspiracy to violate the RICO Act, fraud, extortion, tax evasion, embezzlement of charitable donations, and the most serious federal charges the government can bring. The acting United States attorney said at the press conference, "The allegations reveal a criminal enterprise led by a supposed anti-gang activist and purported music entrepreneur who was nothing more than a violent street criminal." The FBI's assistant director in charge said, "The FBI and our partners have worked for 4 years to bring justice in this case." Henley's attorney stated that his client looks forward to a vigorous defense and maintains his innocence. He is currently in federal custody awaiting trial. 1995. The credits roll. The audience is still laughing. Debo limping away from the block. Craig Jones getting the girl. The neighborhood returning to the slow, warm rhythm of a Friday afternoon in South Central. A man who was never in those credits walks out of the theater and back into his city. Hollywood had taken the most specific, most recognizable version of his particular kind of power, the neighborhood enforcer, the man people moved around like weather, and turned it into 2 hours of comedy. But the man himself had already understood something that the film could not contain. The neighborhood bully operates on one block, but the man who controls the city operates everywhere. For 30 years after that movie opened, Eugene Big U Henley Jr. built something that no Hollywood version of a neighborhood enforcer could have predicted. A criminal enterprise that prosecutors described as mafia-like, a charity that took money from one of the most beloved athletes in NBA history and a 4-time All-Star and pocketed it. A record label that launched one of the most iconic rappers Los Angeles ever produced. A 6-part documentary on a major streaming network presenting him as a reformed man giving back. And underneath all of it, the same system he had been running since the 1980s. Leverage. The man whose approval you needed before you operated in his city. The man who resolved disputes for a price and generated that price through fear that was never stated directly and never needed to be. The movie made Debo famous. The federal government spent 4 years building a case against the real man. Eugene Big U. Henley Jr., founding member of the Rollin' 60s neighborhood Crips, 13 years in federal prison, music executive, charity founder, documentary subject, mentor to Nipsey Hussle, facing 43 federal counts, presumed innocent until a jury decides otherwise. But the wiretap is real. The words on that recording are part of the federal court record, and the FBI did not spend 4 years on a charity case. Every story so far has had a Hollywood version and a harder real one sitting underneath it. The last one closes that gap almost completely because the woman who played her wasn't acting nearly as much as you'd think. There is a scene in The Wire that people who have never even watched the show have seen. A woman walks into a hardware store, Home Depot. She is small, quiet, dressed like a teenage boy. She walks up to the counter and asks the clerk about a nail gun, the most powerful one they sell. The clerk starts explaining the specs, how many nails per minute, what kind of charge it uses, how deep the nail goes, and the woman listens, calm, patient, like she is buying a lawnmower. Then she pays, cash, and walks out with a tool that she is about to use for something the clerk will never know about. The scene is famous because of what it does not say. It does not explain what the nail gun is for. It does not show you. It lets your imagination fill in the blank, and your imagination goes somewhere darker than any camera could. The actress in that scene is a woman named Felicia Pearson. The show calls her Snoop. She plays one of the coldest enforcers in the history of television, a member of Marlo Stanfield's crew. A character so calm, so flat, so eerily unbothered by what she carries out that audiences assumed the performance was the work of a trained, disciplined actor who had studied the role for months. She was not a trained actor. She had never taken an acting class. She had never been on a set before. She had never read a script before the one David Simon handed her. And the calm you see on screen, the flat affect, the stillness that made Snoop one of the most terrifying characters in television history, was not a performance. It was memory. Because before Felicia Pearson played an enforcer on The Wire, she was convicted of second degree at the age of 14, tried as an adult, sentenced, served over 6 years in a women's facility in Maryland. She walked out in her early 20s with a record, no education, no prospects, and no reason to believe that the world outside the walls would be any different from the one that put her inside them. She was not acting on The Wire. She was remembering. And this is the story of the woman behind the character, the real Snoop. This is that story. Start with where she came from. Because the story of Felicia Pearson does not begin with a casting call. It begins in a place most people do not survive. East Baltimore, 1980. Felicia Pearson is born into a world that has already given up on her before she takes her first breath. Both of her biological parents are in the grip of addiction. Her mother is using while pregnant. When Felicia is born, she is premature. She weighs less than 3 pounds. She is born addicted. The hospital keeps her alive. The state takes her immediately. She is placed in foster care before she is old enough to know what foster care means. And here is the first thing you need to understand about Felicia Pearson's life, because it frames everything that comes after. East Baltimore in the 80s is not a neighborhood. It is a system, a machine that takes in children and sorts them based on what is available, not what they need. The row houses look the same from the outside. Brick fronts, marble steps that the old women still scrub on Saturday mornings because that is what their mothers did. Churches on every third corner, the architecture of a place that used to work. But inside those row houses, the crack epidemic is dismantling families faster than any institution can respond. Mothers are disappearing into addiction. Fathers are absent or locked up. Grandmothers are raising children they do not have the energy or the resources to keep safe. The foster system is overwhelmed. Caseworkers have caseloads that would take 3 people to manage, and the children who fall through the cracks do not fall into a safety net. They fall into the street. Felicia falls into the street. She was not failed by one system. She was failed by all of them at the same time. The family system failed her at birth. The foster system took her in and moved her around. The school system saw a kid acting out and responded with punishment, not help. The streets saw a child who needed protection and offered the only kind they had. East Baltimore in the 80s and 90s is not a place that raises children. It is a place that sorts them. If you are lucky, if you have one stable adult in your orbit, if you land in the right foster home, if you connect with the right teacher, you might get sorted towards something that looks like a life. If you are unlucky, if every adult around you is either absent or broken, if the only structure you can find is the structure the corner provides, you get sorted the other way. Felicia got sorted the other way. By her early teens, she is in the streets, not because she chose the life, because the life is the only thing that chose her. She is small, she is tough. She carries herself with a hardness that most adults do not develop until their 30s, and she is 13. 14. A child with the eyes of someone who has already seen too much, and then at 14, the worst thing happens. The details are documented through her own account and through the court record. A confrontation with another girl, a fight in the street, the kind of fight that, in a different neighborhood, ends with a bloody nose and a suspension from school. In East Baltimore in 1994, it ends differently. The other girl does not survive. Felicia Pearson, 14 years old, is charged with second degree. The state of Maryland tries her as an adult. An adult. She is 14. She is convicted. She is sentenced to 2 concurrent 8-year terms. She is sent to the Maryland Correctional Institution for Women in Jessup, a women's prison. She is a child, and the women around her are grown, with grown convictions and grown histories and grown pain. Think about what that means for a 14-year-old girl. You are in a facility designed for adults. The women around you are in their 20s, 30s, 40s. Some of them have been inside for years. They have their own hierarchies, their own rules, their own ways of surviving. And you are a child dropped into the middle of it, expected to navigate a world that grown women struggle with. In her memoir, Grace After Midnight, Felicia described those years with a flatness that tells you more than any dramatic retelling could. She did not romanticize the experience. She did not describe some Hollywood awakening behind bars. She described survival, day by day, learning how to move, learning how to carry herself, learning when to speak and when to be silent and when to make herself small enough that nobody noticed her. She served over 6 years. She went in as a child. She came out as a young woman. But the world she came out into had not been waiting for her. She serves over 6 years. Felicia comes out in her early 20s. She has no degree, no trade, no connections to any world outside of Baltimore's streets. She works dead-end jobs. She struggles. and the pull of the street, the only world she has ever known, is always there, always offering the one thing the legitimate world will not give her: familiarity. And then, on a night she could not have predicted, something happens that changes the entire trajectory of her life. She walks into a nightclub in Baltimore, and standing across the room is a man she has never met. A tall, intense man with a scar on his face who carries himself like he knows something the rest of the room does not. His name is Michael K. Williams, and he is about to become one of the most celebrated actors in television history. He plays a character named Omar Little on a show called The Wire, a stick-up man who robs the men who move the product. A character so beloved, so magnetic, so impossibly alive that audiences will debate for decades whether Omar is the greatest character in the history of television. Williams and Pearson talk, and Williams, who grew up in the projects of East Flatbush, Brooklyn, who carries his own scars, who understands the language of the streets the way only someone who has lived in them can, recognizes something in Felicia immediately. She is the real thing, not an actor playing tough, not a performer with a backstory she researched at a library. The real thing, the hardness, the stillness, the flat calm that comes from having survived something most people will never experience, and knowing that nothing in a nightclub or a casting room or a television set will ever be as dangerous as what she has already been through. Williams brings her to Simon. David Simon is the creator of The Wire, a former Baltimore Sun reporter who spent years covering the city's streets and its institutions and its failures. Simon built The Wire on a principle that no other show in television had ever committed to with the same discipline: authenticity. He cast real Baltimore, not actors from New York playing Baltimore characters, real people from the city. Melvin Williams, the Kingpin who inspired the character of Avon Barksdale, appears in the show as a reformed community figure called the Deacon, a real Kingpin, playing a reformed character in a show based on his own life. Donnie Andrews, the real stick-up man who inspired Omar Little, consulted on the show and later married the writer who helped create the character. Andrews had jumped 6 floors from a building during a real confrontation. The show made it 4 because the writers thought 6 would seem unbelievable. The Wire did not just tell Baltimore's story, it used Baltimore's actual people to tell it. And when Michael K. Williams brought Felicia Pearson to Simon, Simon saw exactly what Williams saw: a woman whose entire life was the thing his writers were trying to put on paper. A woman who did not need to study the world of Marlo Stanfield's crew because she had lived in that world since she was old enough to walk. He cast her as Snoop. No audition tape, no acting reel, no agent, no manager. A woman who had been convicted at 14 and served 6 years walked onto the set of the most acclaimed drama on television and became one of its most iconic characters. She appeared in seasons 3, 4, and 5, 23 episodes, and from the first frame she was on screen, something was different. The other actors on The Wire were extraordinary: Idris Elba, Dominic West, Wendell Pierce, Andre Royo, Lance Reddick, some of the finest dramatic actors of their generation, delivering performances that changed the standard of what television could be. And Felicia Pearson, with 0 training, held the screen against all of them. Not by being louder, not by being more dramatic, by being less. That is the thing people miss about what made Snoop work. Every other actor on the show is performing. They are brilliant at it, but they are reaching for something. They are using craft and technique and years of training to inhabit characters who are not them. Felicia is not reaching for anything. She is already there. She has been there since she was 14. The flatness, that the audience reads as menace is not a choice. It is what a person sounds like when the capacity for surprise has been removed by experience. When nothing on a television set, no matter how intense the scene, no matter how high the stakes, can come close to what you have already lived through. And here is the detail that tells you exactly how real her presence was. The other actors noticed. In interviews after the show ended, multiple cast members talked about what it was like to work opposite Felicia. They used the same word over and over: authentic, not talented, not skilled, authentic. Because in a room full of people pretending to be something, she was the one person who was not pretending. The nail gun scene is the one everyone remembers, but the scene that tells you who Snoop really is comes later, in the final season. When Snoop's time on the show comes to an end, she is sitting in a car, and she looks in the rearview mirror and asks a question. A simple question, about how she looks. It is the only moment of vulnerability the character ever shows, the only moment where the mask slips. And it is devastating because you realize in that second that Snoop is not a monster. She is a human being who has been turned into a tool by a world that never offered her anything else. Felicia did not study that moment in an acting class. She lived it. The show ended in 2008, and here is where the story takes the turn that should break your heart but probably will not surprise you, because The Wire ended. The cameras stopped rolling, the set was packed up, the actors went back to their lives, and Felicia Pearson went back to hers. And hers was East Baltimore. The show had made her famous. It had not made her rich. Felicia had fame. She did not have a safety net. In 2011, 3 years after The Wire ended, federal agents executed a sweep in Baltimore targeting a distribution network. Among those arrested was Felicia Pearson. She was charged with conspiracy to distribute. The same world The Wire had depicted, the same streets she had grown up on, the same cycle the show had tried to expose, had pulled her back in. She pleaded guilty. She was sentenced to supervised probation and community service. She avoided going back inside. But the arrest itself told the world the thing The Wire had been saying for 5 seasons. The systems that fail people do not stop failing them when the cameras show up. They do not stop when the critics write their reviews and call the show a masterpiece. They do not stop when a woman from East Baltimore becomes famous for playing a version of herself on television and then goes home to the same blocks that made her who she is. The Wire won awards for showing America the truth about cities like Baltimore. Felicia Pearson was living that truth. And when the show ended and the truth was no longer profitable, she went back to the only world that had ever claimed her. Michael K. Williams, the man who discovered her at the nightclub, the man who brought her to David Simon, the man who played Omar, was found on September the 6th, 2021, found in his Brooklyn apartment. He was 54 years old. The man who changed Felicia Pearson's life by seeing something real in her at a nightclub. The man whose character, Omar Little, was inspired by a real stick-up man named Donnie Andrews, who himself was gone by 2012. 3 real lives, all tangled together in a show about how the streets consume the people who walk them. And Felicia, the real Snoop. She wrote a memoir in 2007 called Grace After Midnight. She told her story in her own words. The foster care, the streets, the conviction at 14, the prison, the nightclub, the Wire, the arrest after. She has been open about her life in a way that most people in her position never are. She does not hide from the conviction. She does not pretend the arrest in 2011 did not happen. She does not perform redemption for the cameras the way television teaches people to perform it. She tells the truth, the same way she told it on The Wire. Flat, calm, without apology, without drama. The way a person tells a story they have lived so deeply that the telling itself has no emotion left in it. So what do you take from the life of Felicia Pearson? Take this. A girl was born addicted in East Baltimore in 1980. She was taken from her mother before she could open her eyes. She was moved through a foster system that did not protect her. She was sorted by the streets into the only life that would have her. She was convicted at 14 and served 6 years in a grown woman's prison. And then a man saw her at a nightclub and recognized something in her that Hollywood had spent millions trying to fake. She walked onto the set of the greatest television drama ever made, and she did not act. She remembered. And what she remembered was so real, so still, so terrifyingly authentic that audiences assumed she must be the most disciplined performer in the cast. She was not. She was the least trained person on that set. And she was the most convincing, because the distance between Felicia Pearson and the character she played was not a performance. It was nothing. They were the same person. The show just gave her a script to hold. 6 people, 6 real stories, and underneath every one of them, a piece of history that got softened, sped up, borrowed, or left out of the credits entirely. That's the whole reason this channel exists. Not to say Hollywood got it wrong, but to show you what got left on the cutting room floor. If you want more of this, the full-length versions of every story in this video are on the channel right now.